My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 36 years old, and 8 days ago I was living the kind of ordinary Tuesday that never makes anyone suspicious. I was wrong. The call came in at 6:42 in the evening. I remember the time because I was standing at my kitchen counter in Albuquerque, slicing an onion for dinner, and my phone buzzed against the cutting board hard enough to skid an inch. The name on the screen said Marion Voss Gallery, NYC. I didn't recognize it. I almost let it go to voicemail. My hands smelled like onion and I wiped them on a dish towel before I picked up, already annoyed at the interruption, already thinking about nothing more complicated than what temperature to set the oven. The voice on the other end was a woman named Priya Chandrasekharan. She introduced herself as the gallery's acquisitions director. She asked, very carefully, very slowly, if she was speaking to the legal guardian of a young man named Eli Reyes, born in Portland, Oregon, 22 years ago. My chest went tight. I said yes. I am his father. She told me that a painting had come through their authentication process, a large format acrylic piece titled Yellow Room, Number 4, that had been consigned 3 months earlier by a gallery in Santa Fe, and that provenance research had traced the piece back to a series of works produced at a supported living arts program in Oregon between 2011 and 2013. She said the piece had just sold at a private preview auction. She said the number twice, like she didn't trust me to hear it the first time. $2.5 million. I set the knife down. I remember doing that very deliberately, like if I didn't put it down first I might drop it. The onion sat there half-cut, and the smell of it filled the kitchen while I stood absolutely still, phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark. Eli is my son. He's autistic, largely nonverbal, and he paints. He has painted since he was 4 years old, filling notebook margins and then canvas boards and then, eventually, whole walls of his room with color arranged in patterns that used to look, to me, like nothing more than a boy working through something he couldn't say out loud. I never once, not for a single day of his life, thought of it as a career. I thought of it as Eli's way of talking. What I did not know, what Priya Chandrasekharan had to explain to me twice because I kept interrupting her with questions that didn't make sense yet, was that 11 of Eli's paintings had left our house between 2010 and 2013, during the 2 years my parents, Harold and Denise Reyes, had physical custody of him. During the 2 years I was not allowed to see my own son. During the 2 years that started the day my parents disowned both of us and ended the day they simply stopped answering the phone. 10 years. Not one letter. Not one birthday card. Not one photograph mailed in an envelope, not one voicemail left out of guilt at 2 a.m. 10 years of silence so complete I had genuinely started to believe my parents were capable of forgetting we existed. And now there was a painting. A painting worth more money than I had earned in the last 6 years combined. A painting that, according to gallery records, had been consigned not by me, not by Eli, but by a woman named Denise Reyes. My mother. Before I tell you what happened after that phone call, and before I tell you what I found when I pulled the consignment paperwork 3 days later, paperwork with a signature on it that should never have existed, I want to ask you something. What time is it right now, where you're watching this? Where in the world are you? Is it raining there, or clear, or somewhere in between? I ask because I think about that sometimes, how a story like this starts in one kitchen in Albuquerque with an onion going soft on a cutting board, and ends up traveling to kitchens and living rooms and cars all over the world. I'm curious how far this one goes. I stood in that kitchen for what felt like 20 minutes but was probably closer to 4. Priya was still talking. She was asking whether I had documentation establishing legal guardianship, whether I had ever formally relinquished custody, whether I understood that the gallery had a fiduciary obligation to pause the transaction pending clarification of provenance. I heard about half of it. The other half of my brain was doing something else entirely. It was running backward, fast, through 10 years of silence, trying to figure out how my mother's name had ended up on paperwork attached to my son's art. I asked Priya to email me everything. every document, every scan, every signature page. She said she would, and she did. 40 minutes later, a PDF titled Reyes_consignment_packet_final.pdf sitting in my inbox like something radioactive. I didn't open it right away. I turned off the stove. I went and sat on the edge of my son's bed. He was at his day program until 6, so the room was quiet, sun coming in low through the blinds, throwing stripes across the floor and across the stacks of sketchbooks he still fills, even now. Even in a group home 3 miles from where I live, even after everything. I sat there and I thought about the last time I saw my parents' house. I thought about the smell of my mother's kitchen, cinnamon and bleach, a smell I hadn't let myself think about in years because it still did something to my stomach every time it surfaced. 10 years is a long time to build a life around a silence. I had done it. I had built a whole architecture of acceptance, Eli and me, just us, a good life, small but ours, and I had told myself, on the nights it got hard, that whatever my parents wanted from disowning us, at least it was clean. At least it was final. At least they weren't still out there doing something with what was left of him. I was wrong about that too. I didn't open the PDF that night. I told myself I would, right after I picked Eli up, right after dinner, right after he was settled into the routine that keeps him steady, bath at 7, 30 minutes of music with noise-canceling headphones, lights out by 9. But routines exist for a reason, and mine is this: I don't let anything touch Eli's evening until Eli's evening is done. Not phone calls, not paperwork, not ghosts from 10 years ago wearing my mother's handwriting. So I picked him up from the Sunrise Day program at 6:15, same as always. He was standing by the window when I walked in, the way he always stands, rocking slightly on his heels, watching the parking lot like it might do something interesting. He's 22 now, tall like his mother was, with my dark hair and a habit of humming 3 notes over and over when he's content. He hummed them when he saw me. That's how I know it was a good day. We went home. I made dinner, not the onion dish, I'd lost my appetite for that one, just rice and chicken, plain, the way he likes it. He ate with his hands cupped around the bowl the way he's done since he was small, methodical, unhurried. I watched him and I thought about the word consigned. I thought about how strange it was that a word that ordinary could sit in my chest like a stone. After his bath, after the music, after the door to his room was closed and the hallway light was dimmed to the setting he needs to fall asleep, I sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and I opened the file. The first page was a standard consignment agreement from a gallery I'd never heard of, Sable and Finch, in Santa Fe. Dated 14 months earlier. The consignor was listed as Denise M. Reyes, with an address in Bend, Oregon. My mother's address. My childhood home, or close enough. They downsized after I left, but it was still her handwriting on the line, still her signature, a signature I would know anywhere because I'd watched her sign school permission slips and grocery checks and, once, the papers that ended her relationship with her only grandson. The second page was worse. It was an inventory list. 11 works, each given a title, a medium, a date range. Blue Corridor, 2011. Windowfield, 2012. Yellow Room, number 1 through number 4, all 2012 and 2013. I recognized every single one of them, not from photographs, but from memory. I had watched Eli paint some of these on the floor of my parents' sunroom, back when I still had visitation. Back when I was allowed to drive up on Sundays and sit with him for 2 supervised hours while my father stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, making sure I didn't say anything he considered confusing to Eli about where his mother had gone or why I wasn't allowed to take him home. The third page was the part that made me stand up from the table and walk to the sink and just stand there, running cold water over my wrists like I was trying to bring my own temperature down. It was a notarized statement, attached as an exhibit, describing the provenance of the 11 works. It said that Denise Reyes was the primary caregiver and legal guardian of Eli Reyes from 2010 to the present. It said that Eli's father, Daniel Reyes, had been absent from the child's life due to personal circumstances and that Denise had raised Eli with the support of her late husband, Harold Reyes, until his passing in 2019. Harold. My father. Dead 6 years, and I hadn't known. Nobody had called. Nobody had sent a card, an obituary clipping, anything. I found out my own father was dead from a notarized lie in a consignment packet for a painting my son made when he was 9 years old. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds, and I promised myself when I started telling this story that I would not exaggerate anything, that I would not make my parents into cartoons because the truth was already bad enough without embellishment. So let me say only what I know to be true. My mother did not raise Eli from 2010 to the present. She had him for 2 years, from when he was 7 to when he was 9, a period that began the week my wife Carla died, and my parents told me, in the kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and bleach, that I was not stable enough to care for a child like Eli alone, and that if I tried to fight them on it, they would make sure I never saw him again. They didn't get full custody, not legally. I want to be precise about this, because precision matters later. What they got was 2 years of me being too broken to fight back, 2 years of temporary arrangements that had no paperwork, no court order, nothing but my own grief and exhaustion and their absolute certainty that they knew better than I did what my son needed. And then, when I finally pulled myself together enough to demand him back, they handed him over without a word of apology, and 3 weeks later I got a letter, an actual letter, the last one I would ever receive from them, informing me that they were disowning me for reckless decisions and endangering Eli's welfare, and that any future contact would be considered harassment. 10 years of nothing after that. Not one word. Until a gallery director named Priya Chandrasekaran called me about a painting worth $2.5 million, consigned under a story where I don't exist and my father never died alone. I stood at that sink for a long time. Long enough that the water ran warm again, then hot, and I finally turned it off and stood there dripping, staring at my own reflection in the dark kitchen window, trying to figure out which version of my family's story was actually true, the one I had lived, or the one that was now, somehow, notarized. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table until almost 2 a.m., reading the packet over and over, and somewhere around the 4th pass I stopped reading for information and started reading for tone, the specific, careful way my mother had constructed a version of events where she was the hero. She'd always been good at that. I just hadn't seen it clearly until it was sitting in front of me in 12-point font with a notary stamp. To understand how she pulled this off, you have to understand who my mother was before any of this happened. Denise Reyes was, by every outward measure, a good woman. She ran the front desk at a pediatric dental office for 22 years. She organized the church rummage sale every October. Neighbors brought her their problems because she always had an answer, delivered with total confidence, whether or not she actually knew what she was talking about. My father, Harold, was quieter, a retired electrician who spent his weekends in the garage and let my mother make most of the decisions that mattered. That dynamic is important. Whatever my mother decided, my father eventually agreed to. Not because he was weak, exactly, but because disagreeing with Denise took more energy than most people had. I was their only child. I grew up in that house in Bend believing, the way most kids do, that my parents' way of doing things was simply the correct way. It took me until my late 20s to understand that correct and controlling can look identical from the inside. Carla and I married when I was 26. She was a speech-language pathologist, which turned out to matter more than either of us could have guessed, because when Eli was diagnosed at 3, Carla was the one who understood, professionally and personally, what we were dealing with. My parents did not understand it the same way. My mother's first reaction, when we told her, was to ask if we'd tried cutting out sugar. Her second reaction, over the following years, was to slowly position herself as the family's authority on what Eli really needed: more discipline, more eye contact training, less coddling, a phrase she used so often I started hearing it in my sleep. Carla died when Eli was 7. An aneurysm, no warning, gone in an afternoon while I was at work and Eli was at school. I don't need to describe what that did to me. I'll just say that grief like that doesn't leave room for anything else, not meals, not sleep, not the version of myself that used to be able to argue with my mother and win. My parents moved into my house for what was supposed to be 2 weeks to help. Within 10 days, my mother had reorganized Eli's entire routine, and within 3 weeks, she was telling me, gently at first and then not gently at all, that I wasn't in a place to give him what he needed. I remember the exact sentence she used, sitting at my own kitchen table, the same table where I'd later read the consignment packet. "Daniel, I love you, but you are not currently capable of raising this child, and I won't stand by and watch him suffer for your grief." I didn't fight her. That's the part one still have to sit with. I didn't fight her because some small, exhausted, guilty part of me believed she might be right. So Eli went to live with them in Bend, an hour and a half away, and I was left with a house that still smelled like Carla's shampoo and a set of supervised Sunday visits that shrank, month by month, from full afternoons to 2 hours to, eventually, let's reschedule texts that never got rescheduled. During those 2 years, my mother did something I didn't fully understand until I was staring at that inventory list. She encouraged Eli's painting, genuinely, I'll give her that, but she also began quietly cataloging it. She bought him canvas boards instead of the cheap paper I'd always used. She had my father build him an easel in the garage. She took photographs of finished pieces, dated them, and stored them in a filing cabinet in the room that used to be my childhood bedroom. At the time, I thought it was sweet, a grandmother proud of her grandson. I found out later, from the consignment packet's own documentation, that she had begun corresponding with a regional arts nonprofit about outsider art from neurodivergent creators less than 4 months after Eli moved in. She wasn't just caring for him. She was building a portfolio. When I finally pushed back, when I hired a lawyer, informally, just to ask what my rights actually were, since there had never been a court order, just an arrangement built on my own collapse, my parents didn't fight me in court. They didn't need to. They simply handed Eli back, 3 weeks later, with his sketchbooks and 2 duffel bags of clothes, and no explanation beyond "we think it's time." I was so relieved to have him back that I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't ask what happened to the 11 pieces from the filing cabinet in my old bedroom. I didn't ask because I didn't know they existed as anything other than a proud grandmother's keepsakes. 3 weeks after that, the letter came. Disownment, in my mother's handwriting, citing my instability and warning me against contact. I remember reading it standing in my own driveway, Eli asleep in the car behind me, and thinking, she's punishing me for taking him back. Not for anything I did wrong. For refusing to let the arrangement become permanent. I didn't understand, 10 years ago, what that filing cabinet was really worth. I understand now. The next morning I called the lawyer I'd used for Eli's guardianship paperwork years earlier, not because I needed a guardianship lawyer anymore, but because I needed someone who understood art law, and I didn't know a single person who did. She referred me to a colleague, a woman named Renata Ibarra, who worked out of a small firm in Santa Fe and specialized, oddly enough, in exactly this kind of case: authorship disputes, provenance fraud, artist estates. I called her office at 8 a.m. and had a call back by 9:40. Renata was direct in a way I appreciated immediately. She told me the first thing we needed was not outrage, but documentation. Feelings don't move a case, she said. Dates do. Signatures do. Bank records do. She asked me to send her everything, the PDF from Priya, but also anything I had from the 2 years my parents had Eli. Photographs, texts, emails, anything with a timestamp that could establish who Eli actually lived with, who paid for what, who signed him up for school. I spent the next 4 days doing something I hadn't let myself do in a decade, going back through old phone backups, old email accounts, boxes in my closet I'd never fully unpacked since the divorce era of my life. What I found surprised even me. I found the school enrollment records from Eli's brief time at Riverbend Elementary during those 2 years, enrolled by Denise Reyes, listed as grandmother/guardian, with a note in the file, dated March 2011, stating that father's involvement is currently limited per family arrangement. Limited. Not absent. Not terminated. Limited. That single word, sitting in a decade-old school file, was the first piece of paper that didn't match my mother's notarized story. I found bank statements, mine, not hers, but they told their own story. Throughout those 2 years, I had continued making payments toward Eli's medical bills and therapy co-pays, more than $11,000 total, sent directly to providers in Bend. That doesn't happen if a father is absent. That happens if a father is paying for his son's care from an hour and a half away while being told he isn't allowed to see him more than once a month. And then I found the photographs. Dozens of them, on an old external hard drive Carla had used, dated in the metadata, showing me and Eli together, Sunday visits, a birthday. One from Christmas 2011 where Eli is sitting in my lap unwrapping a set of watercolor pencils, my mother visible in the background of the shot, half smiling, arms crossed. Present. Watching. Documented. I sent all of it to Renata. She called me back within 2 days, and her voice had changed, not warmer, exactly, but sharper, more focused, the voice of someone who'd found the thread she needed. Daniel, she said, the notarized statement in that consignment packet isn't just misleading. It's false on its face, and I think we can prove it. But I need you to understand something before we go further. If we pursue this, it stops being about a painting. It becomes about your mother, publicly, on the record, potentially in front of a judge. Are you prepared for that? I told her I was. I wasn't sure that was true, but I said it anyway. The next discovery came from Renata's own digging, not mine. She'd requested the full consignment history from Sable and Finch through a formal letter, citing the gallery's own fiduciary exposure if the provenance turned out to be fraudulent. What came back changed everything again. It wasn't just 11 paintings. It was 14. 3 additional works had been sold outright, years earlier, through a smaller regional gallery in Bend, for a combined sum of $340,000, sold in 2016 and 2017, long after Eli was back in my custody, long after the disownment letter, using photographs and documentation my mother had kept from that filing cabinet. She hadn't stopped after getting him back to me. She had spent years afterward quietly selling pieces of my son's childhood, one painting at a time, under a story that erased me and, eventually, erased my father too, once he was safely dead and unable to contradict anything she said. I remember reading that number, $340,000, and feeling something shift in my chest that wasn't quite anger. It was closer to vertigo. The sense that the ground I'd been standing on for 10 years, the story I'd told myself about a bitter, misguided but ultimately harmless disownment, had never been the real shape of things at all. Renata asked me one more question before we ended that call, and it's the question that pushed me from I want to understand what happened into I want this stopped, formally, with consequences. She asked, has anyone contacted Eli directly? Has your mother, in the last 10 years, ever attempted to speak to him, visit him, or involve him in any of these transactions? I didn't know. I'd assumed the answer was no, because I would have known, wouldn't I? I would have seen a letter, a card, something. I called Eli's group home that afternoon and asked his care coordinator, a patient, careful woman named Fatima Osei, whether Eli had ever received mail or visitors I wasn't aware of. There was a pause on the line long enough that I already knew the answer before she gave it. There have been a few things, she said. I assumed you knew. Fatima and I met in person 2 days later, at a small conference room at the group home, because she said some of what she needed to show me shouldn't be explained over the phone. She had a folder waiting for me on the table when I walked in, and I remember thinking, before I even opened it, that I was getting tired of folders. Tired of the particular dread of paper that's about to tell me something I can't undo knowing. Inside were 4 items. The first was a visitor log printout, standard procedure for the facility, showing that a woman named D. Reyes had signed in as a visitor on 3 occasions over the past 2 years, not to see Eli directly, Fatima clarified, but to attend 2 of the facility's public community art showcase events, open evenings where residents' artwork is displayed for family, donors, and local press. My mother had been walking through rooms hung with my son's paintings, twice a year, for 2 years, without ever once telling me she was in the state, let alone in the building. The second item was worse. It was a copy of a letter, not to me, not to Eli directly, but to the facilities program director, dated 18 months earlier, in which my mother identified herself as Eli's grandmother and informal advocate for his artistic development, and requested permission to photograph his current work for archival and gallery purposes. The letter had been denied, per facility policy requiring guardian consent for any commercial use of resident-created materials, and a note in the file indicated the request had been forwarded to my listed contact information. I never received that forward. I checked later, it had gone to an old email address I'd stopped using 4 years earlier, one my mother, apparently, still had on file from a decade ago, and had never bothered to update, whether by accident or by design I couldn't say. The third item stopped me completely. It was a photograph, printed from a security camera still, time-stamped from the most recent community art showcase, 6 months prior. It showed my mother standing in front of one of Eli's paintings, Yellow Room, number 4, the exact piece Priya had called me about, her phone raised, clearly photographing it, while Eli stood 4 feet away, being helped through the room by a staff member unaware, or at least not visibly reacting, to the woman who had once told me she loved him more than anything, standing that close and choosing not to speak to him. The fourth item was Fatima's own note, written after that showcase, flagging the interaction to her supervisor as a family situation that may require guardian follow-up, a note that had apparently sat in an internal queue for months without reaching me, lost in the kind of institutional gap that isn't anyone's fault and everyone's fault at once. I sat in that conference room for a long time after Fatima finished walking me through it. She didn't rush me. She just sat across the table, hands folded, and let me have the silence. She was photographing his paintings, I finally said, to sell them, while standing 4 feet from him. And she didn't say hello. Fatima didn't try to soften it. That's what the record shows, she said. I'm sorry, Daniel. I should have flagged this to you the moment it happened, and I take responsibility for that gap. It won't happen again. I believed her. I didn't blame her, the failure was systemic, a lost email address, a queue that moved too slowly, not malice. But it told me something important. My mother hadn't stumbled into this. She had been quietly, patiently harvesting my son's art for a decade, adjusting her methods when doors closed, using an old email address instead of confirming she had the right one, using public events instead of direct contact, always staying one careful step away from anything that could look, on paper, like what it actually was. I called Renata that night and told her everything. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I've thought about many times since. This isn't just a provenance dispute anymore, Daniel. This is a pattern of a person deliberately maintaining access to a vulnerable young man's work while avoiding any accountability to his legal guardian. That's not just civil. Depending on how the consent violations shake out, that could touch on exploitation statutes too. I want to bring in someone else, a colleague of mine who handles cases involving vulnerable adults specifically. I think we need her. Her name was Colleen Marsh, a family law attorney who'd spent 15 years working guardianship and vulnerable adult protection cases before moving into private practice. She joined a call 3 days later, and within 20 minutes of hearing the full timeline, she said something that reframed the entire situation for me. You keep describing this as your mother selling paintings, Colleen said. I'd encourage you to start thinking about it differently. What she's been doing is using an adult with a documented disability, one she is not the legal guardian of, as an unpaid, unconsenting source of commercial product, for over a decade, while deliberately concealing that activity from the person who is his guardian. That's not a family dispute about hurt feelings. That's exploitation. And I think once we lay out the paper trail properly, a court is going to see it the same way. I remember sitting with that word, exploitation, feeling it settle into a place in my chest where, for 10 years, I'd stored something smaller and sadder. Abandonment. Rejection. A mother who'd simply decided she didn't want us anymore. I had grieved that version of the story for a decade. It turned out to be the wrong story entirely, and somehow, that was harder to sit with, not easier. I want to be honest about something here, because I promised myself I wouldn't clean this story up more than it deserves. My first instinct, after that call with Colleen, was not measured. For about an hour, sitting alone in my kitchen with the folder from Fatima still open on the table, I wanted to drive to Bend that night. I wanted to stand on my mother's porch and ask her, to her face, how she'd managed to look at a photograph of her own grandson and see inventory instead of a person. I didn't do that. Not because I'd suddenly become a calmer man than the one who wanted to, but because Colleen had said something else on that call that stuck with me harder than the word exploitation did. She said, the moment you go to her directly, without documentation locked down, you give her time to destroy records, reframe the narrative, or worse, contact Eli directly and create a mess that a court will have to untangle later, with him in the middle of it. Right now, you have the advantage of her not knowing how much you know. Don't spend that advantage on a conversation that won't change anything. I did not have a clean answer for what I wanted more, a confrontation, or a resolution. I think, honestly, some part of me wanted both, and knew I couldn't have both at once, and that not knowing which one to choose first was its own kind of exhausting. So I chose the slower path. Over the following 3 weeks, Renata and Colleen worked in parallel. Renata handled the art side, formally notifying Sable and Finch and the Marion Voss Gallery in writing that the provenance claims in the consignment packet were disputed, and that any further sale or transfer of the pending painting needed to be paused pending resolution. The Marion Voss Gallery, to their credit, complied immediately and placed the $2.5 million sale in escrow, unreleased to any party, while the dispute was reviewed by their in-house counsel. Colleen handled what she called the guardianship exposure, filing a formal petition in Oregon, where Eli's original custody arrangement, or lack of one, had occurred, to establish, on the record, that I had never relinquished legal guardianship, and to request a protective order limiting my mother's contact with facilities where Eli resides or attends programs, pending a full accounting of the sales. That last part required something I hadn't expected, a forensic accountant. Colleen brought in a woman named Preeti Anand, who specialized in tracing asset histories for guardianship and estate disputes. Preeti's job was to build a complete financial picture of every sale connected to Eli's work, going back as far as records existed. It took her 11 days. What she found, when she presented it to Renata, Colleen, and me on a shared call, was more than any of us expected. It wasn't just the 11 paintings from the original consignment packet, and it wasn't just the 3 additional pieces sold in 2016 and 2017 for $340,000. Preeti had traced a total of 19 separate works, sold or consigned between 2013 and the present, across 4 different galleries in 3 states, generating a combined total, including the pending $2.5 million sale, of just over $3.1 million. $3.1 million. From a boy who, for most of that period, was living with me, attending a public school, receiving Medicaid-funded therapy services, I filled out the paperwork for myself, believing, because I believed it too, that his art was simply something he did to calm himself down after a hard day. Not a business. Not an asset. A way of talking. Preeti had also found something else, something that Colleen said, quietly, was going to matter more in front of a judge than almost anything else in the file. In 2019, the same year my father died, my mother had opened a trust, the Eli H. Reyes Legacy Trust, using a portion of the proceeds from the earlier sales as seed funding. On paper, the trust's stated purpose was the preservation and promotion of the artistic legacy of Eli Reyes. In practice, based on the trust's own banking records, less than 4% of the funds that had passed through it in 6 years had ever been used for anything connected to Eli directly. The rest, property tax payments on my mother's house, 2 vehicle purchases, a kitchen renovation, and a standing monthly transfer to her own personal checking account, had gone to Denise Reyes. She had built a trust with my son's name on it, and used it to renovate her kitchen. I remember laughing when I heard that detail, an ugly, involuntary sound that surprised even me, because it was so absurd it almost broke the horror of everything else into something smaller and stupider. Colleen didn't laugh. She said, flatly, "That's not incidental spending, Daniel. That's a textbook misappropriation of trust assets, especially if the trust was ever represented to any gallery, buyer, or institution as being for Eli's benefit. That's the piece that turns this from a civil dispute into something a district attorney might be interested in." That was the moment the plan shifted from get the truth on the record to something with real teeth. Colleen recommended we file simultaneously a civil petition to freeze the trust and compel a full accounting, a formal report to the Oregon Department of Human Services regarding the undisclosed contact at Eli's facility, and, pending Preeti's final report, a referral to the district attorney's office in Deschutes County for possible fraud and misappropriation charges. "There's one more thing," Colleen said, near the end of that call, and I could hear something careful in her voice, the sound of someone about to hand me a decision instead of just information. "Your mother doesn't know any of this is coming. We have a scheduling opportunity here. There's a fundraising gala at the Meri and Voss Gallery in 3 weeks, tied to their fall private sale season. Priya Chandrasekaran has confirmed that if the provenance dispute isn't resolved by then, the gallery intends to publicly announce the sale is paused, pending review, as a matter of their own liability protection. Denise doesn't know that yet either. If we time the legal filings to land right around that event, you have a choice. You can let this play out entirely through paperwork, quietly, which is the lower risk option. Or, if you want a public accounting, not for revenge, I want to be clear, but because a public record sometimes does more to actually stop this kind of pattern than a private settlement does, that gala is where it would happen." I sat with that question for 4 days before I answered it. I spent those 4 days doing something that had nothing to do with lawyers or trusts or paintings. I spent them with Eli. I picked him up early from the day program twice that week, took him to the community pool he likes, the one with the shallow end where he can stand at the edge and let the water move around his ankles for an hour without anyone rushing him. I watched him hum his 3 notes and flap his hands at the sunlight bouncing off the surface, and I thought about the fact that somewhere, in a climate-controlled storage facility in Santa Fe, a painting he made when he was 9 years old, in a sunroom he probably didn't even remember, was sitting in an unmarked crate worth more than my house. I didn't ask him about any of it. Renata and Colleen had both been clear, gently but firmly, that involving Eli directly, asking him questions about paintings from over a decade ago, showing him documents, trying to get any kind of statement from him about his grandmother, would not hold up legally in any meaningful way given his communication profile, and more importantly, would not be fair to him. This wasn't his fight to carry. It was mine, because I was the one who'd failed to notice it happening for 10 years, whether or not that failure was really my fault. On the 4th day, I called Colleen back and told her I wanted the public accounting. Not a scene. Not shouting. I told her explicitly I didn't want anything that would embarrass Eli or turn him into a spectacle, and she assured me the plan she had in mind didn't involve him being present at all. What I wanted was simple, even if getting there wasn't. I wanted my mother to have to explain herself, on the record, in front of people who had built their understanding of her, and of the story behind Yellow Room, number 4, entirely on the fiction she'd constructed. I wanted the fiction to end in the same kind of room where it had been sold. The next 2.5 weeks were the most procedurally intense of my life, and I mean that in the most unglamorous way possible. It wasn't dramatic. It was binders. Colleen filed the guardianship petition in Deschutes County Circuit Court, docket number assigned, a hearing date set for the following month regardless of what happened at the gallery event. The gala timing was a strategic choice, not a legal requirement, and Colleen was careful to remind me of that distinction more than once. Renata sent formal notice to all 4 galleries Preeti had identified, laying out the provenance dispute in writing, with documentation attached, and requesting each gallery preserve all sale and consignment records pending review. 2 of the 4 galleries responded within days, cooperative and clearly nervous about their own liability. The 3rd took longer. The fourth, a gallery in Scottsdale that had sold two of Eli's earliest pieces back in 2013 for a combined $61,000, never responded at all, which Renata said told her plenty on its own. Preeti finalized her forensic report on a Thursday. It ran to 41 pages. I read all of it, twice, sitting at my kitchen table with a highlighter, the same table where this had all started with an onion going soft on a cutting board weeks earlier. The final summary page laid out, in a single table, 6 years of trust transactions, $340,000 in direct art sales prior to the trust's creation, $2.71 million in sales and pending sales after, of which $2.5 million was the frozen Meri and Voss sale, and total documented withdrawals to Denise Reyes' personal accounts of $187,400 for expenses. Preeti's report characterized, in careful forensic language, as unrelated to the stated charitable purpose of the trust. Colleen also brought in a detective from the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office, a soft-spoken man named Detective Aaron Whitfield who specialized in financial crimes against vulnerable adults. Whitfield reviewed Preeti's report and, after 2 follow-up interviews with Fatima and with Priya from the Meri and Voss Gallery, opened a formal investigation into potential elder. No, I remember correcting myself when I first heard the term, because it wasn't my mother who was vulnerable here, it was Eli. Whitfield called it financial exploitation of an adult with a disability, Oregon revised statute language I hadn't known existed a month earlier and now had memorized against my will. Whitfield asked me one thing directly, on our second call, that I've carried with me since. "Mr. Reyes," he said, "I want to understand your goal here clearly, because it changes how we build this. Do you want restitution? Do you want charges? Do you want both, or are you still deciding?" I told him the truth, which was that I didn't fully know, and that what I wanted most, more than money, more than seeing her in handcuffs, was for there to exist, somewhere, permanently, an official record that said what actually happened to my son during those 2 years and every year since, not her version, not a notarized fiction, the real one. Whitfield said that was a reasonable goal, and that pursuing charges and restitution was, in his experience, usually the most reliable way to make sure a record like that actually got made and actually stuck. The gala at the Meri and Voss Gallery was set for a Saturday evening, 3 weeks and 2 days after Priya's original phone call. Colleen's plan, worked out carefully with Priya and the gallery's own counsel, was not a public ambush in the way you might imagine from a movie. It was more precise than that, and stranger, because it depended on my mother walking into that room believing she was still the person controlling the story. She had, according to Priya, confirmed her own attendance 6 days earlier, invited, as consignor of record, to the private preview reception where Yellow Room, number 4 was to be formally unveiled to top-tier collectors before the paused sale could even be discussed. She did not know the sale had been placed in escrow. She did not know a guardianship petition had been filed in Deschutes County. She did not know Preeti's 41-page report existed, or that Detective Whitfield had spent the last 10 days building a financial crimes case with her name on it. She thought she was going to a party to celebrate the biggest sale of her life. I flew to New York the day before the gala. I hadn't been back to that city in years, and I remember standing in my hotel room off Madison Avenue, looking down at the street, feeling less like a man about to confront his mother and more like someone watching another person get ready to do it in my place. Colleen had flown in too, along with Renata by video conference standing by, and Priya had arranged for the two of them, along with the gallery's own general counsel, a careful, unhurried man named Desmond Alcott, to be present at the reception in an official capacity. The plan, as Colleen laid it out to me one final time over dinner that night, was not for me to make a scene. It was for the gallery to do what any gallery legally has to do when a provenance dispute becomes formalized, pause the unveiling, and require the consignor to address the dispute in the presence of gallery counsel before any further action could proceed. My presence, and Eli's story, would simply be the truth that filled the space once my mother's version collapsed under its own weight. I didn't have to attack anything. I only had to be there when it fell. The gallery was on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse building in Chelsea, all white walls and museum lighting, maybe 80 people in the room when I arrived, holding a glass of sparkling water I never drank because my hands were too unsteady to trust with anything. Yellow room, number 4 hung on the far wall under a spotlight, roped off, a small printed card beside it that still, at that point, read, Collection of D. Reyes, Bend, Oregon. I stood near the back and watched people walk past it, pausing, tilting their heads, saying things like extraordinary use of negative space about a painting my son made on the floor of a sunroom while trying to calm himself down after being taken from his father. My mother arrived at 7:20, in a navy dress I didn't recognize, hair done, moving through the room with the easy confidence of someone who has told a story so many times she's forgotten it isn't true. She didn't see me at first. She was talking to Priya near the entrance, laughing at something, and I watched her laugh and felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, just a kind of flat, exhausted clarity. Desmond Alcott approached her at 7:35, Priya at his side, and asked, politely, if she could join them in the gallery's private viewing room for what he called a brief matter regarding the piece's documentation, before the formal unveiling proceeds. I watched her face when he said it, a flicker, quick, gone almost before it registered, the look of someone recalculating in real time. She agreed. Of course she agreed. Refusing would have looked worse. I gave it 2 minutes, then followed with Colleen. The private viewing room was small, white-walled like everything else, a round table with 6 chairs. My mother was seated when I walked in, Desmond and Priya across from her, and I watched her see me for the first time in 10 years. I want to describe her face honestly, because I've thought about it many times since. It wasn't shock, exactly. It was closer to the look of someone watching a bill finally arrive that they always knew, somewhere, was eventually going to come due. Daniel, she said. Just that. My name, flat, testing the air. Hi, Mom, I said. I sat down. Colleen sat beside me, opened a folder, and said nothing yet, letting the silence do its work first. I don't understand what this is, my mother said, looking at Desmond, then at me. Priya said there was a documentation question. There is, Desmond said, and his voice was calm in a way that made the room feel colder. The gallery has received formal notice, with supporting documentation, disputing the provenance statement filed with this consignment. Specifically, the claim that you were Eli Reyes's primary caregiver and legal guardian from 2010 to the present, and the claim regarding the circumstances of Daniel Reyes's involvement in his son's life. That's, my mother started, and stopped, and I watched her reach for the story, the same story she'd been telling for a decade, and find, for the first time, that the room wasn't going to simply accept it the way rooms always had before. Daniel wasn't well after Carla passed. Everyone who knew us at the time knew that. I did what needed to be done. You had him for 2 years, I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, which surprised me, because I'd imagined this moment loud, 4 weeks, and instead it came out almost gentle, which somehow made it worse for both of us. Not 10. 2. I paid $11,000 in his medical bills during those 2 years from an hour and a half away. I have the bank records. I have the photographs from every Sunday you let me see him. And Dad didn't die alone with no one to tell me, Mom. He died and you just never called. Something moved across her face at that, the first thing that looked, to me, like it might actually be real. You have no idea what those 2 years cost me, she said, and her voice had an edge now, defensive, sharpening. I raised that boy. I got him into programs. I taught him to hold a paintbrush properly. You were a shell of a person, Daniel, you could barely function, and I am not going to sit here and apologize for stepping in when my grandson needed someone who could. Then explain the trust, Colleen said. The room went very still. My mother looked at Colleen the way you look at someone who has just said a word in a language you thought no one else in the room spoke. What trust, she said, and it wasn't really a question, more a stalling move, buying half a second to think. Colleen opened the folder. She didn't raise her voice. That was the thing I noticed most, watching her work, how little theater there was in it, how much of what followed was just facts, laid flat on the table, one after another, like tiles. The Eli H. Reyes Legacy Trust, Colleen said. Established in 2019, the same year Harold Reyes passed away, funded initially with proceeds from art sales you conducted without Daniel's knowledge or consent. Over the 6 years since, this trust has received approximately $2.71 million in additional proceeds from sales and pending sales, including the piece currently hanging on this gallery's wall. Our forensic review found that less than 4% of those funds were ever used for any purpose connected to Eli. The remainder, $187,400 documented so far, was transferred to your personal accounts and used, among other things, for a kitchen renovation completed in 2021. My mother's mouth opened and nothing came out for a moment. Priya was very still across the table. Desmond had a legal pad in front of him and was writing something, unhurried. That trust was for his legacy, my mother finally said, and her voice had changed, lower now, less certain, reaching for footing she couldn't quite find. Preserving his work, promoting it, that takes money, Denise's Daniel, that takes resources, storage, framing, insurance. Insurance on a kitchen island? I said. I hadn't meant it to come out that sharp. I didn't take it back. You don't understand what it's like, she said, and now there was something almost pleading underneath the anger, to watch a grandson who can't tell you what he needs, and to have to guess, every single day, whether you're doing right by him, while his father was. Was what, I said. Grieving? Working 2 jobs to keep the medical bills current on a kid I wasn't allowed to see more than 2 hours a month? You didn't have to guess what he needed, Mom. You had to guess what would sell. She flinched. It was small, but I saw it, and some part of me that had spent 10 years wanting exactly that reaction felt no satisfaction in it at all. Just a tired kind of confirmation. Desmond spoke next, still calm, still procedural. Ms. Reyes, given the documentation presented, the gallery is required to pause this sale indefinitely pending resolution of the ownership dispute. I want to be clear that the gallery takes no position on the underlying family matter, but we cannot in good conscience proceed with a transaction where legal guardianship and consent are actively contested. He paused. I should also inform you that a formal report has been filed with the Deschutes County Sheriff's Office regarding the trust's financial activity, and that a detective may be in contact with you directly. That was the moment my mother's face changed completely, not anger anymore. Not the practiced defensiveness of a woman explaining herself to a room she still believed she could win over. It was something closer to fear, and underneath the fear, something I hadn't expected to feel anything about at all. She looked, for just a second, very old. Older than I remembered her being. Older than the woman in the navy dress who'd walked into this room 20 minutes earlier laughing with Priya at the door. Daniel, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on my name, I never meant for it to become this. I thought I was protecting his work. I thought someone had to make sure it didn't just get thrown away, get lost, and you weren't in a place to. I've been in a place for 10 years, I said. You just never called to find out. Nobody said anything for a while after that. Priya eventually broke the silence, quietly, professionally, informing my mother that gallery security would need to escort her from the building once the meeting concluded, as a standard liability precaution given the active dispute, and that all future communication should go through counsel. My mother nodded, small and mechanical, the nod of someone whose body was complying before her mind had caught up. I stood to leave before she did. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't say anything final or cinematic. No last line meant to land like a closing shot, because that isn't how it actually felt in the room. It felt smaller than that, and stranger, like watching a door that had been locked for 10 years finally get pushed open, only to reveal that what was behind it was just a sad, tired woman who had convinced herself, for a decade, that taking without asking was the same thing as loving. I walked out past Yellow Room, number 4, still hanging under its spotlight, the little printed card beside it not yet updated to reflect anything that had just happened in that back room. I stood in front of it for a moment, this painting my son made when he was 9, yellows layered over each other in a way that used to just look, to me, like a boy working something out with his hands. I still don't fully understand what he meant by it. I don't think that's the point. I don't think it ever was. The weeks after the gallery were slower than I expected, which I suppose is how most real consequences unfold, not in a single dramatic scene, but in a series of quiet, procedural aftershocks that arrive by mail and by phone call rather than by confrontation. Detective Whitfield's investigation concluded 4 months later. My mother was charged in Deschutes County with 1 count of criminal mismanagement of a trust and 2 counts of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, both Class C felonies under Oregon law. She accepted a plea agreement rather than go to trial. On Colleen's advice, I didn't push for the maximum, not out of forgiveness exactly, but because a trial would have required Eli's records, his facility, his routines, to be dragged into open court, and I wasn't willing to trade his stability for a longer sentence. The plea resulted in 5 years of probation, a formal restitution order requiring repayment of the $187,400 in misappropriated trust funds, and a permanent injunction barring her from any future contact with Eli's residential facility or day program without written consent from me as his legal guardian. The civil side resolved separately. The guardianship petition was granted without contest. My mother's attorney didn't fight it, which told me plenty. The Deschutes County Court formally confirmed what should have never been in question. I had never relinquished guardianship of my son, not in 2011, not ever. The trust itself was dissolved and restructured under independent oversight, with the $2.5 million from Yellow Room, Number 4 and the remaining proceeds from the 18 other pieces, after gallery commissions, legal fees, and the restitution order, placed into a new, court-supervised account in Eli's name, administered by me with annual reporting requirements to the court. Total funds preserved for him, just over $2.6 million. The Scottsdale Gallery, the one that never responded to Renata's initial notice, ended up facing its own scrutiny once the Oregon case became part of the public record. An art law blog picked up the story roughly 2 weeks after my mother's plea was finalized, and within a month, 2 additional buyers who'd purchased Eli's earlier pieces came forward independently, concerned about clouded title, requesting their own provenance reviews. I didn't chase any of that. I let the paper trail speak for itself, the way Colleen had told me it would from the very beginning. I did not have a clean feeling about any of it, even once it was finished. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one too often end with a kind of tidy relief that doesn't match what it actually feels like. I didn't feel triumphant reading the plea agreement. I felt something closer to grief, a second grief, different from the one I'd carried after Carla died, this one for the mother I'd spent 10 years quietly hoping might someday call, might someday explain herself in some way that made sense of the silence. She did explain herself, eventually, in that back room in Chelsea. It just wasn't the explanation I'd been hoping for. I saw her once more, 7 months later, at a mandated restitution hearing neither of us was required to speak at. She looked smaller in the courtroom than she had in the gallery, older still, and when the hearing ended, she looked over at me from across the room, and I thought, for a second, she might try to say something. She didn't. She just nodded, once, and I nodded back, and that was the last time I saw my mother. Eli doesn't know any of this happened, not in the way you or I would understand it. I never explained the trust to him, or the gallery, or his grandmother's name in a police report. What I did do, about 4 months after the dissolution order, was take him to a small framing shop near his group home and have 3 photographs printed, not of the paintings, of him, painting, at 9 years old, a photo I found buried in Carla's old hard drive. Sunlight coming through a window I now recognized as my parents' sunroom. We hung them in his room. He looked at them for a long time the day we put them up, humming his 3 notes, and then went back to what he was doing, which was, of course, painting something new. He still paints every day. He doesn't know his work is worth anything beyond what it's always been worth to him, which I think, honestly, is the only kind of worth that ever really mattered here. I set aside a portion of the court-supervised funds for his current and future care, better housing eventually, art supplies he never has to ration, a support worker 3 days a week instead of 2, and I left the rest exactly where the court placed it, untouched, growing slowly, waiting for a future I can't fully picture yet but am no longer afraid of. I think about my father sometimes, more than I expected to. I never got to ask him what he thought of any of it, whether he agreed with my mother the whole way through, or whether he was just a quiet man who let louder decisions happen around him until it was too late to say otherwise. I'll never know. I've made a kind of peace with not knowing, the same uneasy, imperfect peace I've made with most of this. Forgiveness, I've come to think, is a personal thing, something you can offer or withhold entirely on your own terms, in your own time, or never at all. But access to a life, to a child, to a story you don't have the right to rewrite, that has to be earned. My mother never tried to earn hers back. She just tried to sell what she still had access to, one painting at a time, and hope no one ever asked where it came from. So here's what I keep coming back to, the question I don't have a clean answer for, even now. If someone in your family had quietly taken something from you, not money, not property, but years, access, the truth of your own story, and then tried to profit from it while telling everyone a version where you didn't exist, what would you need to see happen before you could call it resolved? Would a court record be enough? Would an apology, if one ever came? Or is there some kind of loss that doesn't actually resolve, that you just learn, slowly, to carry differently? Thank you for watching. Everything in this video is fictional, made only for entertainment and reflection, and none of it depicts real people or real events. If it resonated with you anyway, I think that's because the underlying truth is a real one, that healing rarely comes from getting the last word, but from finally refusing to let someone else keep writing your story for you.